Hi, I'm really happy to be here. Usually I talk about sort of more big picture, heady, wacky things, and I was really happy that Eve asked me and Jennifer to talk about personal practice, because it's something that's been an important part of my life, and it's sort of allowed me to go into the weird and wacky possibilities without completely losing myself. But I don't tend to address it too much in this kind of situation, so I'm really happy to. In talking about this, the category of practice, I almost even hesitate to use the phrase spiritual practice. But I am talking about something like spiritual practice, and the reasons and the way that many of us are drawn to practices as opposed to belief systems, as opposed even to communities who all gather together to participate in a certain kind of belief system. I think I can speak for most of us that we come out of a tradition, a kind of countercultural tradition, an alternative tradition that's inside the modern world and in some degrees inside the Western world, where the question of practice is more important often than the question of belief. When we hear a spiritual call, when we feel the tug of the sacred, our instincts are often to approach it through practice, and that can be through meditation, through yoga, through ritual practices, through magical ceremony, through work with sacred substances. There's a whole range of tools and techniques, some modern, some traditional, some that look traditional but are actually kind of modern, some that might seem modern but actually go way, way back. And it's by investing ourselves and our time in these practices that we start to approach and satisfy the urge for the sacred, for the spiritual. And I think there's just sort of two positive functions of practice, and explains why it is that not just ourselves, but the kind of countercultural or alternative tradition that we come out of has been so drawn to practices. One is that it's about experience, that we are, for very good reasons, suspicious of overarching belief systems. The idea of just simply adopting a new belief system in order to solve certain problems or to satisfy a sense of lack or a sense of seeking in ourselves, doesn't often work that well. And instead of being drawn to new belief systems, we have this intuition and this sort of cultural transmission that, check it out for yourself, sit down on the mat, go to the retreat, go to the jungle, drink the tea, check it out, see what happens to yourself. It's a commitment to a kind of ongoing process, a kind of perpetual intuitive experiment that we commit to more than committing to a belief system, even though beliefs definitely come up along the way, sometimes in a positive way and sometimes in a negative way too, because often the practices that we involve ourselves in have with them a set of beliefs or a set of agendas. And one of the tricks with practice is learning how to balance these things and even to ferret out one from the other. So it's the promise of experience that in part draws us deeper into the call of practice and to practicing with practices. And the other reason, I think, and it's often a less conscious one, at least for many people, is that practice and experience in general tends to pull against, or at least has the potential to pull against, the problem of authority. The problem with received belief systems, particularly when they involve supernatural claims, heavenly promises, hellish threats, etc., is that they're expressions of a certain kind of authority structure. And that I believe that an important part of the spirituality that has been explored in these alternative and countercultural ways derives its power and some of its core intuition from the desire to avoid that kind of authority. Of course, there's all sorts of authoritarian cults and sects and meditation systems, and you know all about that, but there's a countervailing tendency. And so the draw towards practices is partly because while maybe I get my practice from a tradition, or a teacher teaches me my practice, on some level, I'm on my own. I explore it on my own. I discover my own way of dealing with it. And increasingly, authority comes not from an external structure, or a charismatic teacher. But authority comes from my own confidence and my own experience of the unfolding of my practice. And there's a profound political, psychological, social dimension to this, as well as a spiritual one, which I'll talk about a little bit more when I come back after Jennifer introduces her set of ideas.
So, what else is practice on a more meta level? It's a lot of things. One, it's an invocation. It's a summoning of whatever it is that you feel to be holy into your life. A lot of us are people who seek experiences with meaning, experiences with the sacred. A practice is a way of wooing meaning. It's a way of courting the sacred. That's one. It's also a way of giving form to the ineffable. So, particularly if you don't come out of a particular tradition where you have the shape of the holy, it's a god or a set of gods or something that you can look at, that you can define. You have to make your way in deciding what exactly it is. And then your desire to interact with meaning, with holy, with sacred, requires an objective sense. So what you're doing when you're undertaking your practice is that you're creating the circumstances of your interaction with the sacred, giving it form and allowing you to encounter it. It's two. And then finally, a practice is also just a practice in the same way that you practice piano. So by undertaking a practice, you're learning how to move within the sacred. How do I carry forth ritual? How do I interact with meaning? What am I doing? And you practice that. And often the beginnings of practices, particularly if they're not ones you've known since you were a kid, are a little awkward. It's just like when you start playing the piano. You don't really do it naturally. You need to learn the mechanics of the movements. Practices are the same way. Over time, as you become more familiar with the mechanics of the movements, you start to really be able to explore the space, find the weird little ripples and see the patterns and be able to play with those. So practice, in that sense, is just practice. I want to be moving within the realm of the sacred, and I need to practice how to do that gracefully. I think at its best, the idea behind performance is often the bringing together of these two different ideas of practice. In the same way that your piano recital is the culmination of your practice, I think a performance is meant to be a culmination of these different senses of practice.
So one thing in terms of the question of embarking on a practice is fundamental intent. And I don't necessarily believe that yoga or meditation or Tai Chi or mantra or prayer or isolation or fasting or psychedelics necessarily brings you to enlightenment, liberation, total transformation of your being. I think we've seen a lot of evidence of people who have committed themselves fully and deeply to intense spiritual regimens for long periods of time and come out more or less the same kind of people on the other side. And sometimes you meet people who are just awake, and you're like, what happened? And they're just like, well, one day I just dropped it all. Or, it's something exists on a different plane. But nonetheless, we have this draw, we have this call, I certainly do, to do something, to explore, to experiment. And so I think one thing setting out is it's really important to recognize that that your practice is an experiment as much as it is a doing to get you someplace that you think you need to be. But when you hear the call, when you hear the inspiration to practice with your experience, to shape, to form your daily life in some way, there's always the, well, so what do I do? What's calling me? What am I going to experiment with? What am I going to find? And one of the things that's sitting out there in the spiritual marketplace are traditions which offer sciences of understanding, whether they're physical practices or at least principally physical practices, hatha yoga or Tai Chi and such, or more, imagistic practices, visualization, or silent meditation, a whole set of things. There's a whole lot of traditions that are there waiting for you. And it's an interesting relationship, because why does one enter into a particular tradition? Some of the reason we enter into tradition is because it's kind of nice to think there's an answer, or at least that there's a system that's really going to work. And it seems like a lot of kind of traditions are kind of asking you to sign up for a whole set of things at the door. And in my own experience, I found it's a very interesting kind of dance, where on the one hand, I'm really open to engaging with the worldviews implied by a system, let's say, like Tibetan Buddhism. But at the same time, I have kind of a more, I guess I'd call it a sort of anarchist, freewheeling perspective, where I'm like, well, I'm just going to see what happens here. I'm going to see what happens out of this experiment, even though it's inside of a tradition. And one potentially negative aspect of that is that you somehow hold back from the full fruits that are being offered. But I think a very good thing about it is it keeps your feet on the ground when a lot of games are being played. And a lot of games are played around practices because they're powerful. They change your mind, they change your spirit, they change your dreams, they change your energy body. There's a lot of stuff going on, and so keeping one foot on the sort of, well, experimental tip is often very helpful. My own experience with a sort of traditional practice, or more or less traditional practice, was Zen meditation. And I came to it because I was in India and met a Tibetan monk, actually, an American man, and he handed me a book by Tsongkhapa, and we had this like 10-minute conversation, and my eyebrows beamed. I got the Buddhist memes inside me. They kind of just went, and I was like, Buddhism, 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 Buddhism. And happens to a lot of people. And so I came back to the US and I was like, okay, I really want to like check this stuff out. So I actually went to see him and started to do meditation inside of the Gelugpa tradition. And that was just way, way too much rigmarole for me. I mean, it was like you were like memorizing all these stages, and there were words, and there were stages of your visualization and all this stuff, and I'm like, whoa, man, there's a lot of programming going on here. It's like, I just kind of want to meditate. I just kind of want to like, just sit for a while. So I stumbled into a small Zen meditation group, and I really like Zen because there's a lot of rigmarole. There's the whole bowing thing, it's all kind of stern, and there's the robes and all the Japanese sort of aesthetics, which are pleasant and I find kind of conducive, put you in the mood. But basically, once you're sitting down, they just leave you alone. They just leave you alone. So it's a great place to balance structure and chaos. And for me, that's one of the ways of understanding, particularly, what meditation is about. So if I was sort of talking about practice in general before, now I'm really going to go in and talk about meditation, which has been my most fruitful practice. And earlier, Danny mentioned the contrast between Saturn and Neptune as a really important transit in our period of time. And in some ways, I think about meditation as kind of a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. The Saturn part of the equation, well, actually I'll start with the Neptune. The Neptune part of the equation is dissolution. This is the dissolution of our patterns of thinking, of the way we hold ourselves in our bodies, of the way we think of ourselves as being in this body, looking into a space, of the boundaries between consciousness and reason and dream and direct perception. That part of what you're doing is you're allowing the situation to dissolve these boundaries, to dissolve the habits of mind that hold you in particular kinds of thinking patterns. So there's this tremendous kind of fluctuating, dripping meltdown that can go on with the simple application of commitment to just sitting. And this can lead into very powerful, intense states of energy flow, of trance, of dream, and it can go a bit far. I spent quite a long time, a year and a half, thinking that I had actually tuned into this kind of like magic frequency, down here in my belly, and I could really root in. And it was only much later that I realized I was just learning how to hypnotize myself. I was just getting into a really pleasant trance state and basically just kind of tuning out. So there's that kind of Neptunian melting quality to it. which is ideally paired with the Saturn. And what Saturn represents is a kind of cutting, a kind of break, a kind of a limitation, not in the sense of being locked in, but of calling into question the more expansive, energized ways of being and experiencing things. And what that cutting is sort of the not that, not that, no, not that, not that, not that, a kind of constant disidentification with the contents of consciousness. I mean, that's one of the great gifts of meditation over time, is the ability and the experience to see the arising of the most profound and intimate parts of the self, of the way you think, of your memories, of your experiences in your body, your experiences in place and with other people, and to recognize that they, in some sense, are not you. You know, who you are is another question that I will thankfully leave aside. But it's certainly the case that partly what you're doing in meditation is this disidentification process, which is the root of a lot of its healing. So it's a combination of these elements that really work forward. Now, would I have discovered any of this without committing myself to Zen Buddhism? Probably not, because I'm kind of a lazy guy, and I like I like sitting. I'll do it sometimes, but my whole experience with practice has been a kind of fitful, constant going on and going off. And I think a lot of us, when we actually look at our real relationships to practice, and not our idealized images that are sold back to us by teachers, by the manufacturers of goods that support these practices, by our own idealistic ideas, by our own needs to beat ourselves up, we actually find that practices kind of come and go. And one of the great things about traditions, and even one of the great things about really believing in a tradition, at least for a little while, is because it just, gets your ass on the mat. It gets you working. It gets you committed to returning to this place until something happens maybe that dissolves the whole need for being inside of a traditional structure in the first place. So in that sense, I am, forever indebted to the long hours in the Zendo and all of the funny kind of Japanese/American rigmarole, which itself is constantly changing and probably will not look the way it does today, even in a generation, let alone 2 or 3 generations. There are a few other things that came from the experience of this particular tradition that I think are very valuable for those of you who have a meditation practice or are interested in developing one. And one was a profound emphasis on the postures in the body. It always strikes me as kind of amazing the amount of meditation that is taught and practiced with a pretty weak kind of engagement with the posture. Because I'm sure many of you practice yoga, the meditation position is just a yoga posture, and just the same kind of degree of finesse and care and attention and constant slight modulation that you bring to a posture in a yoga practice, which may look static, but it's constantly slightly dynamic. The same things are going on in a physical meditation practice all the time. So there's this, in Zen, there's a tremendous emphasis on transmission, and if there was one thing I got from these talks I went through and all the books I read and the koan study and the procedures of bowing, the chanting, the stories we heard, the most important transmission was the physical posture. And it's such a simple one. And that's part of the kind of spiritual anarchy, is that the more the tradition you're tapping into is full of very simple, very grounded elements, the more it's like, oh, I know what I have to work with, and I have that, and then I go. What else do I need? Is it really so complicated? Do I really need so much? So if the body was one side of it, the other side of it was simply the breath. I mean, it's the most obvious thing. I'm sure many of you have done this and heard it 100 times, of just beginning a meditation practice with the focus on the breath. And there are 2 nice dimensions of this. One is simply that the breath operates as a remarkable interface between your conscious awareness and the unconscious processes of the body. So by drawing attention to the breath, you bring your attention to precisely that place I described earlier of dissolution between the boundaries of the kind of known, conscious, rational ego that's sort of moving around, and this larger holistic space that it's embedded in all the time with all of its kind of intuitive or not apparent activities. And the attention on the breath brings you right to that position, right to that line. And the other thing about the breath is just, it's a great way of breaking through the initial chatter, because if there's one thing that stands in the way of the deeper processes of meditation, it is the tapes that are running all the time. And there's got to be a game you play with the tapes. You're not going to shut them off, but you're going to learn how to, it's almost like apply feedback mechanisms, so they start to kind of just echo into the distance, and they're sort of like a background hum rather than an insistent voice that is going to hold on to your train of consciousness. So these things sort of really, can set one going on a personal practice. And I just kind of want to sort of, wind up with a little talk about why I've sort of emphasized this kind of anarchic, in some ways individualistic way of experiencing this particular practice. And it has to do with the whole situation of spiritual authority. That a lot of the motivations we have in life, seeking approval of all the games we get into with people in our friend groups, in particular with people in positions of authority, we're playing these kind of, mommy daddy games and approval games a lot. That whole structure is really, really intense. And if you look at the whole sort of experience of the last generation, and generations earlier too, but just the last, the sort of hippie generation, of their experiment and experience with practices, you see just enormous disasters caused by spiritual authority. Not because the people were not enlightened or at least profound teachers. Some of the most powerful teachers, in my opinion, from the 1970s, Rajneesh and Trungpa, were also, more or less directly involved in producing really bizarre and pretty fucked up scenes. That doesn't, and there's a whole complicated reason for why things happen that way. There's a lot of dimensions to it. It's not black and white. But it's certainly the case that I think that we've discovered that there are some significant problems with the basic structure of spiritual authority inside of these alternative currents. My favorite shamans are the ones who say, I'm not a shaman, I just know how to like mix the stuff and just, set up the room, and, I can do some stuff with feathers, but, I'm not, don't come to me looking for the answers. And it's a hard lesson. It's something we don't really want to learn, and it's precisely by exploiting that desire for outside authority that a lot of sort of difficult things happen. But I really believe that ultimately what you're discovering, even if in a muddled, kind of half-ass, sometimes lazy way, is your own spiritual authority. And what a teacher ultimately recognizes is just like, hey, you got the goods already. You're already there. And the beauty about meditation for me is that it's brought me more and more into that place where I don't need to have a method. So when my personal practice, I'll watch my breath for a while if I'm super chattery, and then once things have settled down, there's no method. I'm not doing anything. I'm not, I should be bringing my attention to this part of my body, or I should be visualizing some, illustrious being that's giving me golden juice. Sometimes the illustrious beings come, but most of the time they stay away. And instead, what I'm actually doing is just experiencing a creative chaos. And that's kind of the funniest trick of all, is that we approach practice with the idea of method, the idea of technique. But really what we're uncovering is this creative spontaneity, this chaos. And chaos is a lot about what's going on now in the big world. Both the hard side, the damaging, turbulent side of chaos, and the creative, fruitful, earthy side of chaos. And meditation offers a great way to kind of return and allow that process of chaos to move through your own being. And does it help? Is it gonna save the day? Is it gonna liberate you? Maybe yes, maybe not, maybe not. But I'm convinced that it's by having a personal engagement with that kind of not knowing, with that kind of letting go, that kind of immersion in the muck of trance and vision and possibility, and the constant return to, what is this? Is this me? Am I this? Am I this? There's something about that process that puts us in tune with the possibilities of chaos that are lurking everywhere. And in addition, it also allows a great way of responding to genuine chaos when it occurs. In my own life, I found that the more that I've been thrown into situations that were unpredictable, unexpected, somewhat traumatizing and out of control, is that there was a kind of clarity, a kind of coolness that was booted up inside without my doing it all, that is very much resonant with the kind of mind that's developed in meditation and in other kinds of trance work and consciousness work as well. So it's that little taste of creative chaos that I believe keeps me going. I just want to say one more little bit about that. I like a lot of people, did a lot of meditation practices. I had a couple of really cool experiences, and then there was one time I had one that was just, really interesting awakening, very profound, very short, very intense, as intense as lots of nitrous oxide, really fast. And I went up, and it happened in a yoga class, and I was like, I had this whole thing, and I was like, wow. And I went up to the guy and I said, I was doing that camel pose, and well, have you ever done nitrous oxide? And he's like, yeah. And I go, well, it's kind of pretty much like that. He goes, well, you got to watch it because you can there's blood circulation. You're going to cut off blood flow to the brain, and you can pass out. And I went, no, man. I mean, you've done nitrous oxide. I mean, it was like the beings. And he goes, oh, well, there's these sort of energy levels of energy, and and he kind of went into he moved from a physical explanation to a sort of esoteric explanation. And then you kind of realize it's like, there's just maps, they can hand you a map, they can kind of give you a certain reflection, but the experience itself is going to pull you forward and undermine you at the same time. And the desire for authority or external validation of what you have is ultimately not forthcoming. And meditation for me has been a way to move into that space of tenderness and not knowing. And in that sense, it remains for me the kind of practice of practices. Perhaps to honor this little bit of chaos and as a kind of palate cleanser for the rest of the talk, which Jennifer will have, let's do 1 minute of silent chaos.
So this question of spiritual authority is where I base my practice of, in fact, inventing my own practices. Erik talked about the spiritual marketplace, and often the idea of putting together your own practice, the kind of mix and match, bricolage method of putting together this and that is critiqued as the spiritual supermarket, particularly American or North American way of going about things. But in fact, this has a very old tradition. This is what folk religion is. This is what people doing folk religion, basically people practicing, have been doing since time immemorial. And in an age when we have access to so many different kinds of practices, different kinds of teachers, different kinds of experiences, this is simply drawing from a wider range. It's kind of I think of it as a postmodern folk religion. And especially for people like me or like Erik, who didn't grow up in a tradition, there is, in a sense, no easy road to authenticity. Even if I'm undertaking a Zen practice, as I have, I've chosen it. You know, already implicit is the choice of the supermarket. So, especially for more anti-authoritarian types, and I think probably most of us fall into that category, the idea of taking on your own practice, of taking the spiritual authority and putting something together yourself and saying, well, nobody else can validate my experience. Nobody else is going to say, yeah, you did that meditation correctly, or, well, did you see the 8-armed? No, then you weren't there. You know, I mean, you know, and I don't mean to undercut that experience. I think these traditions have great power. I mean, I think going into them, you really encounter the depth and wisdom of people through great ages. But I think there's also power in taking something onto yourself. So what I'm going to talk about now is just a little bit about what I have experienced as the steps toward crafting a practice. And then I'm going to talk about a particular practice I crafted rather a long time ago that continues to be a part of my life. So the steps to evolving a personal practice. The first thing is really identifying where you encounter the sacred. You look around and you see people making practices out of all sorts of things. Prayer and meditation, yeah, certainly, but also painting or, you know, hula hooping, you know, marriage as a practice. I mean, where is it that you encounter the sacred? Where is it that you feel meaning? That's the place where you start. And then establish an initial practice. Decide what your practice is going to be. You can take something from some other tradition, put those things together, come up with something regular, something that has meaning for you. And it could be a pretty basic thing. The point is to something that you'll, and it's like Jenny Pell was saying, you know, start small, don't make some grandiose, you know, pronouncement for yourself. Establish yourself a practice, and then commit to it, and that's very important. You know, in the same way that I talked earlier about playing piano, often it's awkward at the beginning. When you're learning the practice, you don't know how to do it yet, thus the practice part. So even if something feels awkward, to dive into it and allow it to expand really will yield something. And then that's the last part, is to allow it to take its shape over time, maintaining your initial intention and some of the actions from your initial practice. That's very important. But then allowing things that come in to influence what you're doing, allowing it to grow and evolve and take on more meaning, like a relationship with a lover. So the practice that I want to talk about, a practice that I developed long ago, living in New York, grew out of the desire to be in the sacred space, the desire to be encountering the sacred. Now here I am in Manhattan, living in the East Village, and I found myself struggling against this, you know, urban atmosphere. No, I really want to live somewhere that's sacred, you know. And eventually it occurred to me, well, you know, sacralize the place, right? That's the answer. I really liked when Jenny Pell was talking about the interaction with a space where you lose your hair and your nails and your skin, etc., and you take in the food and the air, and you become this sort of inner-outer merging with the space, because that's what a lot of my practice was really about. And for me, the place where the sacred and meaning often resonates is in my dream life. I have a particularly vivid dream life, and always have. So this practice, starting from the desire for practice, finding the place where I had meaning, and then I found some practices that I really liked and sort of cobbled up together. One of them was based on the dream time practices of Australian Aboriginal people, and in a quick condensation of it, when you are born an Australian Aboriginal person, you are put into a dreaming, often a couple of different kinds of dreaming, And you are taught the songs and the path of your dreaming. Now what dreaming is, according to the mythology, the prototypical beings came out of the earth during the dream of the creator. So the honey ants emerged from the ground, and the honey ant walked a path, and from that movement, the sleeping here formed a hollow, coming over here and meeting a wallaby and having a battle kicked up these hills, you know, going through these mountains made a mountainous path. They formed the landscape. So the actions and the interactions of all these prototypical beings are what actually form the landscape. So when you're being taught the song and the walk of your dreaming, you're being taught the song and the walk that your prototypical being took. So if I'm a honey ant dreaming, I'm taught a song about sleeping there in that hollow. I'm taught a song about fighting with the wallaby. I'm taught a song about going through that riverbed. And then as I take the same walk that the honey ant took in this original time and sing the song, so there's the notes for, okay, there's the rocks over there. There's notes for those rocks. And then here's the path over here. There's notes for this path. You know, here's the hollow. There's notes for this hollow. I sing all of those. Those recreate the land around me as I walk through them. What a walkabout is, we've all heard of what a walkabout. What a walkabout is often a puberty ritual, or, you know, sometime during your life is walking your songline and re-singing the earth into existence. And by the way, when you're walking a songline, you are, as an Aboriginal person, you are actually within the dream time. There's an overlay of original sacred time onto this time. And to move from this here into, I'm still this here, but into sacred space is the action of the practice. So that as a sort of a basis for practice. And then the other was art of memory. Art of memory is an ancient practice begun with the Greeks and really taken up by the Romans. And art of memory is a means of remembering a long list of things, a speech, what have you. And what you do in an art of memory practice is you create what is called a memory palace. And this is an imaginal space that's made up partly of a space that you already know, your own home, a library, whatever it is, and that you partly make up. And you learn this space so intimately that it's like your own apartment. And if anyone had moved something while you were away and you got home, you would say, oh, who moved that? You know your memory palace this well. And when you're trying to remember something, you put certain points from the list or the speech or what have you in different places in your memory palace associated with striking features of the house, a statue or architectural elements or whatever. And then you walk through the memory palace as you're giving a talk. And you see the point, and that reminds you of what you wanted to say. So it's this, basically it's this imaginal space, but that you physically move through as a way of recalling. So the practice that I formulated was a dream practice where I would wake up in the morning and I would remember whatever dream I had had, and I would write it in my dream journal, and then I would go downstairs, lived at Avenue A on 5th Street, and I would walk through my neighborhood. I decided what the boundaries of my neighborhood were, and then as soon as I saw the right place, I just let intuition guide me. I would weave the dream into the architecture, so breaking up the dream into sort of bite-sized pieces. Okay, here's the superhero siblings. Okay, now they're going to have a fight on elephants. Okay, now I'm in between them. Whatever it is. And I would weave each part into the architecture of my neighborhood so that the glance of my eye over the natural run of the architecture, the building, whatever it is, would retell the story with the associated images. Now, over the course of this practice, of course, my neighborhood became layered with my dreams. It's still true. If I go back to the East Village and I'm walking along and I'm like, oh yeah, right, there's that great dream with the Peter Max sailboats and the sharks and the women who were flying, or what have you. So it was this process of externalizing what was, for me, the sacred inner space, or this place that had meaning, and superimposing it onto the external world and creating a sacred space for myself by creating this practice that evoked what mattered to me. Now, over time, this practice has changed shape. I've come to understand a lot of other things as part of its lineage, the lineage of this particular tradition, if you can say that it goes, the lineage starts here and sort of goes backwards. Things like Tibetan Buddhist lucid dream practices, which I undertook and then wove into that practice. Or the Sufi ideas of imagination as a faculty, much like the Australian Aboriginals, there's this idea that there's the imaginal world that's sitting over top of this world, and that the imaginal faculty is what gives you access to it. You know, now I'm here in this different space. Or the practices of the situationists, you know, city walks and the derif. All of this has grown to be part of what my own particular practice means. And that practice has shifted a little bit now to writing about the practice, to trying to understand it, and then all of the issues that come with that kind of grappling. Of course, one of the problems in a self-crafted practice is often those places where you have to grapple. Self-crafted practices often don't bring to the rise as much things that are difficult for you because you picked them. But if you let it go long enough and you really let it take its own shape, then I think inevitably you're going to find those places where you really have to, you know, come up against it and, you know, find those rubbing against, they say in Zen. So my current form of the practice, which has been writing, is quite challenging for me, and thus the practice is manifested in that shape.
Great. I think I wanted to finally reflect a little bit about how the things we've been talking about relate to the world we're in. And one of them is that we have no real inherited dream practices, and that the dream world, the virtual world, the world of imagery, of vision, is an extremely important part of the contemporary mindscape. That as we build from everything from building literal virtual worlds to expanding the pharmacopoeia, to integrating the visions of the pharmacopoeia into media technologies, distributing those media images, intensifying the possibilities of visionary experience in club environments, in video games. All this sort of technology of vision is a reflection and a kind of expression of a deeper immersion into a kind of dream time, where it's sort of like the way Daniel was talking about, there's a kind of dissolution between you know, material reality and something a little bit more kind of haunting or more multifaceted. And that, I mean, I've just been watching people talking about dreaming and coming up with dream practices, and moving even beyond individual dream practices into forms of collective dreaming, or trying to create agreements about where to go inside dream space, or to sharing dreams in a way online. And in a way, it's kind of a metaphor, a deeper metaphor for a problem that we're all engaged in, which is that, you know, we all look ahead and we see the horizon, and it's, you know, it's pretty scary, it's pretty grim. And one of the ways of dealing with that is to creatively dream the world we want to move into. And if we don't have a visualization, if we don't have a sense of what this possible world would look like, whether through art or through our own experiences or through depictions of it, through descriptions of it, it's going to be much, much harder to maintain the focus and the will to do it. Even farther than that, though, is my belief that the kind of turbulence that we're entering into, and the increasing power of technology on multiple levels to manufacture material reality and to seed design solutions that have a kind of a rapidly intensifying character, means that we're getting to a place where the possibility of certain kinds of visions, of certain kinds of blueprints and plans, of entering into the stream of reality and actually making things happen increases. So it becomes increasingly important for us to care and manage our dreams, to learn to move into dream space, because it's in that place, in part, that the solutions are being born, and that it's almost like the idea that there are spirits waiting to be born, and that by tapping into the realm of the visionary, in that sense, you're increasing your ability or the tools with which you incarnate or bring things into reality. You get something going, and something's just going to start happening. I suspect that's part of what's going on now. And similarly, I think there's something very important about meditation that I hadn't mentioned before, and it was partly brought up by Jenny's talk. I remember when I was just first starting to learn about permaculture, which I know very little about. I'm a very urban person. The thing where I went, hey, this is pretty cool, is just that idea that when you first start dealing with a piece of land, you don't do anything for a year. You sit there and you watch it. And this kind of watching, I think, is one very crucial dimension of the kind of mind that at least I have been learned to cultivate in a meditation practice, which is it's not a kind of zoning out mind. It's not a kind of trance mind. It's almost the mind as if you were sitting at a forest clearing, at the edge of the shadows of a forest clearing, and you're waiting. You're just waiting and watching to see what happens in the clearing. So you start to kind of space out, and you're like, oh, it's really pretty. It reminds me. No. Waiting. What's happening? What's happening? As if a tiger or a beetle or a snake was about to move through the ground, but you're not quite there yet. You're not seeing the tiger and the snake. It's just the waiting. But there's a kind of expectancy. And that was sort of like, this all really worked with me, this metaphor of the clearing. It comes up a lot in my own practice. And then I heard this marvelous talk by a Zen guy, very grounded, and he was like super earthy, like not into the whole spiritual mumbo jumbo stuff at all. And he was just like, back in the day when we were, Paleolithic tribes, one of the things that somebody was always doing was sitting on the edge of the tribe, looking out and just watching. Someone is always watching. And the mind that you're cultivating, that kind of empty, aware, grounded, spatial, crystalline mind, is one of the ways that we tie back into this tribal consciousness. It's not just about, visionary ruts under the full moon. It's also a very spare and empty openness to the complexity of the material world around us, and not just the natural world, but also very much the urban space as well. And so for me, cultivating that mind is part of the way you move into a place where something like permaculture begins to make sense, not just as an actual practice, but as a metaphor for organizing culture and our living spaces, urban and rural.
And then, along with the cultivating the open mind and the lack of action, one of the things that practice gives you is the movement toward a mindful action. So I was just talking earlier about driving practice. Having the intent to not hurry, having the intent to not lose my temper when I'm driving. We've often had practices between us that are part of marriage practices, and there is something that you're doing with intent and moving forward. And as we contemplate the underlying theme of almost all of these gatherings, which is how do we carry forth the intent and the action that we find in this gathering of our tribe, of our people, sort of out into the world, the idea of forming a practice of moving forward with intent and maintaining that intent and regulating your actions that you learn from practice. So, even a meta level out is practice as a way of simply practicing, as a path toward that sort of mindfulness. Also gives you that bit of education.
All right, I think we've said our piece here, and we have some time, so we'd love to take questions. Way in the back. the question is about what Trungpa called spiritual materialism, or the sneaky way that the ego slips into your supposedly egoless practice. I mean, certainly one of the downsides of the kind of anarchic style that I'm putting here is that there's fewer walls to run up against if you're racing forward with your big ego, or if you're particularly delusional. At least ideally, traditional structures exist partly as a way to undermine those very powerful tendencies, although in my own experience it seems that most traditions are perfectly capable of allowing lots of people to maintain a high level of delusion and ego activity as they're going through the process. So I'm not so sure that that is entirely true at this stage of the game. So the question in a way is like, how does one deal with that? And it's difficult in the sense that there at some point there does have to be that deeper intention to break through the ego and not to hold on to things. In my own life, I was thinking about this question because it's a tough one. And in my own experience, it's been the case that the simple facts of my own experience undermine those processes. So the ever intense return of dissatisfaction, or of conflict, or of the hollowness in my own head, when I'm saying something, I go, no, that's not true. That those sort of functions naturally have dissolved to some degree, the tendency to really claim experiences. One of the great things about Zen in particular is that it's pretty good on instilling that tendency to question the egoic grab at even the most profound kinds of spiritual experiences, so that ideally you go to your master, my God, I saw the Buddha, and he says, they're like, shut up, who cares, let it go, it's just, just visual nothing, it's just Makyo, get back to the pillow. So it seems to me that to some degree these things come up if you're really trying to wake up to your life. How do you generate that really trying to wake up to your life over and against your idea about spiritual practice? I don't know about that. It's a hard one. It seems that some teachers are good at sparking that, and a lot of teachers are just fine keeping the kind of story going where you're the student who's having mystical experiences and I'm the teacher who's kind of keeping things rolling, and aren't we all charismatic, and isn't it nifty how all these powerful things are happening? So in a way I don't have a good answer of like how to avoid that problem particularly, except for this. That one of the reasons that I'm interested in this question of authority is because I'm kind of bothered by like what's going on now with with spiritual evolution that's different than or that's learned from the previous generations in the West. And one of them is, I think, that we're moving, to use a kind of trendy term, towards a kind of open source spirituality, or a peer-to-peer spirituality. And that these terms, which come out of technology, and they have to do with recognizing the tremendously complex, vital, and like good stuff can happen when you have lots of people who are personally deeply motivated and are kind of horizontally connected and working on problems on a shared level, and then collectively things can break through. It's not because they're all like drawn together under the same flag. It's not because they're all believing the same dogma. It's that they're all kind of recognizing that people have different pieces of the puzzle, and that as people find out answers to the puzzle, they put them right out there in the light of day. Like, here it is. This is how it works. No, it's not like you have to like hang around for 10 years and then we finally tell you the great secret, which is that there's not really a secret, but a whole kind of system. And now and a lot of stuff works like that. A lot of occult stuff works like that. A lot of mysticism, a lot of sacred schools it's this kind of game of like, there's someone in the know on the inside. And I think we're really moving outside of that. And that the more we spread a peer-to-peer way of approaching it, the more that we tend to erode that aspect. Because one of the things about really working in collaborative environments, if you're really engaged in them, is that your ego claims are naturally going to hit up against walls, and sometimes there's conflicts and people don't resolve them, and it can be a very tempestuous kind of environment. but the kind of sort of placid, self-sustaining egotism that can come along with spiritual practice, I think has a harder time of surviving in that. I remember this one guy I met who was like spent the 70s like totally involved in all these Hindu groups and doing yoga and you know, and like conscious sex communes, and just the full 70s trip. And where I was like, so what did you get out of all that? What finally happened? And he goes, well, it's like my neuroses gained more charisma.
I also think that this is another one of the places where the start small maxim really comes into play. So, you know, I had a friend who started practicing Zen Buddhism, and I was like, well, you know, great, what are you on about? And he's like, well, I want to become enlightened and be a bodhisattva. Well, that's pretty big. From I'm starting my practice to I want to get enlightened and be a bodhisattva. On the other end of the scale, I have a friend who had a really beautiful practice. It was simply every time he met somebody new, or when he encountered you for the first time, like when you came to his house for dinner, or you ran into him in the supermarket, he had a very brief blessing that he, in his head, just a blessing on you, that he would lay on somebody every time. I mean, every time he met somebody new, and every time and in the path toward becoming a bodhisattva, it seems like small practices toward how do you dissolve your ego and what you do are really good places to come around to that great big goal. Yeah, way in the back again.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about lucid dreaming.
How much time do I have, Eve?
Like 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Repeat the question.
Well, then.
Repeat the question.
Oh, yeah, he asked how lucid dreaming became involved in my dream practice. Really through this practice and through starting to tell people about it and starting to widen the breadth of what I wanted to do, I encountered people who were doing lucid dreaming. Encountered Stephen LeBarish, who's some of whose workshops I attended. He's great. And then started reading this, you know, Tibetan dream practice, and undertook this, got into places where there was lucid dreaming, attempting to move through dream spaces while lucid dreaming. So another layer of how do you experience the East Village is a place that's layered with my dreams. So trying to become lucid and move through those spaces. So sort of a dream subjectivity. So it's all of these issues with subjectivity and objectivity, right? With the overlay of what's in me and outside of me, the me, not me. And so these layers of consciousness inside me, outside me overlay became really obvious with something like lucid dreaming. So if there's a lucid dreaming body that's moving through the space of the external world that in my waking time I have overlaid with my dream experiences, you know, and if I'm flying over them in a lucid dreaming body and seeing what that story is, where is place, where is time? And a lot of the themes that came out of this practice for me really were about that kind of objective, subjective, taking what was deep inside me and externalizing it. So, as you know, lucid dreaming is often meant to be a practice of, you know, well, you know, how real is all this stuff? You know, I mean, and the answer, of course, is that it really is and it really isn't. So, lucid dreaming was really a great layering on top of that, of this, you know, what's inside of me, what's outside of me. I think that's pretty good for 3 minutes.
Are we good? Where are we at? We're done?
You're done.
We're done.
Thanks.
Thank you.